Next, we'll be moving into our climate resilience panel, moderated by Michelle Sevilla. Michelle Sevilla works on local environmental issues and policy in the California State Legislature and is the first network manager of the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. And so I'll pass it to you, Michelle, to speak more about your story and introduce the rest of the panel.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Magandang hapon. My name is Michelle Sevilla. My pronouns are she, her, they, them, sha, and I am the network manager of the Central Coast Climate Justice Network. On top of working on local environmental issues and policy for a California state legislator and being the Central Coast Climate Justice Network first manager, I bring a unique lens as a young immigrant from the Philippines and more than a decade of environmental outreach and education experience in the museum setting, as well as a leader offering my 5 to 9 hours in various organizations working in the nexus of equity and justice in the environmental movement. So from my 9 to 5s and my 5 to 9s, during that latter half of the day, I serve as a board member of the Gaviota Coast Conservancy, a steering committee member of 350 Santa Barbara, and I'm the first chair of the County of Santa Barbara's Equity Advisory and Outreach Committee, now formally integrated into the county's Regional Climate Collaborative. Hopefully, my experience and working in this nexus will help uplift and find some through lines between all of the amazing panelists that I am honored to help moderate for you today. First, we have Irene Juarez O'Connell, co-director of Food What. Irene is a Chicana visual artist, muralist, cultural worker, and active organizer committed to uplifting visions of healing, justice, and resilience through the mediums of community-based art and mural making. Her art centers participatory storytelling, cultural identity, and meaningful placemaking. In addition to her art practice, Irene serves as a co-executive director at Food What, a program that engages youth across Santa Cruz County in healing relationships with land, food, and each other. Irene received her Bachelor's of Arts in both Public Art and Latin American and Latino Studies from the University of California, Santa Cruz. Alrighty, I think take it away, Irene.
All right, thank you so much for that introduction. So my name is Irene or Irene Juarez O'Connell, and like was mentioned, I have the honor of serving this community. I've been here since I graduated in 2012. I was raised by school teachers in the San Fernando Valley, and I bring a lot of the values of education, social justice, and deep love for the beloved community that I serve here in Santa Cruz County. Food What, for those who may not be familiar, is a wellness and empowerment program for high school aged youth across Santa Cruz County. And we use food and farming as a vehicle for liberation, building relationships with one another, and really healing our relationships to the land and to the food that we get to share with one another. I'm also a community artist. I do murals and I paint and create banners for direct action movements. And, you know, I feel that I hold multiple roles in the community, but it all becomes cohesive when I'm imagining, you know, bringing community members together to create visions of hope and resilience for our future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Irene. Next, we have Kiki Velez of the National Resources Defense Council. Kiki Velez works at the NRDC, as abbreviated, where she focuses on the transition to clean electricity in California's buildings. She collaborates with stakeholders and policymakers to transform the state's building stock in alignment with pressing climate, equity, and affordability needs, including through long-term gas system transition planning at the California Public Utilities Commission, Prior to joining NRDC, she worked on gas regulatory reform with the California Building Decarbonization Coalition and Common Spark with the Blue Green Alliance. Her career in climate began with a formative internship in Chair David Hochschild's office at the California Energy Commission. In her free time, she loves to paddleboard, tend to her plants, and explore natural history museums. Velez holds a bachelor's degree in atmosphere and energy engineering from Stanford University and is based in San Francisco.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Michelle, for that introduction. I feel so honored to be on this panel today with all these incredible advocates who are pushing for an equitable climate justice, environmental justice, food justice. I think I have some slides that may be, there they are. Great, thank you so much. And I'll take a second just on this first slide. So as Michelle mentioned, my name is Kiki Velez. I work at the Natural Resources Defense Council on the Clean Buildings team. So dive right into the work. I guess a bit of personal background. I'm from Sacramento. I've been in California my whole life. And I went to school in the Bay Area, and I came in thinking I would study computer science, as many aspire to do in the Bay Area. But then I started learning more about the climate crisis and learning how it intersected with so many of the issues that matter to me. As mentioned before, like Irene works on food justice, but it also intersects with labor justice, farm worker rights, racial justice, and economic justice, access to nature, and access to transportation. So clearly a lot of links, but I've chosen to focus in my career on buildings. So now diving into the work that I've been doing. California's buildings account for 25% of our state greenhouse gas emissions. And as some of you may know, California has committed to achieving carbon neutrality economy-wide by 2045. So to do that, we have to reduce emissions across all sectors, and buildings account for a lot of those emissions. So it's critical that we cut emissions from the building sector. And important to note, gas appliances, so burning gas in homes, for example, a lot of California's space and water heating needs, and also a lot of our cooking needs, and even some of our clothes drying needs are met by combusting gas, natural gas, quote unquote, natural gas in homes, which results in carbon dioxide emissions, of course, which are global warming emission, but it also results in carbon monoxide emissions, in formaldehyde emissions, and in nitrogen dioxide emissions, which can all, a growing body of research is showing, can have detrimental impacts on health and indoor air quality. And research also indicates that these impacts can be worse in low-income communities and communities of color, and especially in communities that are already experiencing horrible air pollution and that might be co-located with power plants or like near freeways and might have higher instances of asthma already. The use of gas in homes can exacerbate those health issues that the communities already face. So what can we do about this? If you could go to the next slide, please. So the solution. So California, in line with our carbon neutrality goals, also has goals to transition the electricity sector to 100% clean electricity through renewable resources. So, for example, like wind and solar. So as we make that transition, it makes sense, and modeling has shown that the lowest cost path to decarbonizing our buildings is to switch from these polluting gas appliances that result in greenhouse gases, but also in other pollutants that deteriorate health in homes, to clean and efficient electric appliances, which can also save people money on their energy bills. So if you'll go to the next slide, please. But of course, this is going to be a challenge. People oftentimes, especially low-income communities, people who might be working multiple jobs to make ends meet, people who already experience the highest percentage of energy burden, meaning that they, like low-income and disadvantaged communities, tend to pay a higher percent of their income on energy already. You can imagine that making the transition to electric appliances might be really hard, and you know, rightly so, might not be the first thing that comes to mind for people. So making, oh, I'm getting a note that it's time. So I'm going, I can discuss any of these further throughout this panel discussion if people have questions, but these are some of the things that are important to make this transition work for California communities. Thanks.
Thank you, Kiki. Next in our panel, we have Roberto Garcia Ceballos. He is a community and cultural organizer and strategist based in Los Angeles or Tongva land. He was born in Mexico City and raised in San Jose, California. He's a co-founder of two community-based organizations, Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre and Community Power Collective, that work collectively to build collective land stewardship, community power building, and cultural vitality.
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Roberto Garcia Ceballos, and like it was said, I was born in Mexico, and my family migrated to the U.S. and we landed in San Jose. So I know Watsonville pretty well, and I actually learned to swim at the beaches in Watsonville with my dad, and so it's really nice to kind of be connected to people up north. But a little bit about myself, I've been doing housing organizing for over 10 years now. And I got really involved in when the housing crisis happened in 2008, really setting up eviction defenses for people experiencing foreclosure. And my journey in life took me to Massachusetts for a couple of years, where I spent a lot of time in Western Massachusetts supporting folks and growing community power and supporting people in remaining. And so when I think about crisis, I think about environmental crisis, and then I also think about human-made crisis as well, which I think are both the same. And I think about the financial hell that people go through. And so in a lot of ways, that led me back to the West Coast, and where I really worked on anti-displacement campaigns and have been working on anti-displacement campaigns in Boyle Heights and East LA. And a lot of time I learned, took a lot of time to learn around affordable housing and the mechanisms that we use today to finance and to develop and to understand what housing looks like when we're trying to support low-income folks and working class people. And so that's led me to really focus my work in the last 3 years in forming a community land trust with community residents, mostly senoras in the neighborhood, mostly community residents that want to stay and want to live here and want to continue to nurture their families here. And so for us, community control of land has really been a really motivating factor for us to think about alternative ways of how we could own or steward land together, and really think about housing not only as in the way that they taught us in terms of using the market, but really thinking about it as home as it should be, in terms of a place for our families, a place to steward, a place to share, and I'll talk more about in my presentation.
Thank you so much, Roberto. Last and certainly not least, we have Lanny Faulkner, founder of Equity Transit, a local organization, spent part of her youth during the 70s riding buses and BART through San Francisco and listening to funk music. Lonnie's background as a researcher guided her deep dive into local public transit issues as conversations with representatives of underserved populations expressed ways in which their lives were being impacted by local political influences working to dampen underserved voices. Lonnie is a mom and woman of color who served for 7 years as a mountain bike coach for middle and high school kids. She's also a triathlete and a classically trained opera singer with a BS and MS in physiology from UC Davis and has been a certified NOLS first responder since 2007. Years as an undergrad and graduate student at UC Davis ingrained the importance of safe biking routes and robust public transportation.
Thank you. And if we could get the slides up, that would be great. Now I'll start talking while the slides are coming up. My name's Lonnie Faulkner, and I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the Climate of Hope. We are at code red climate crisis levels, which means we have very little time to make changes that ensure living beings on this planet can continue to thrive. Transportation is the primary contributor to environmental crisis, and the lack of public transportation in this country contributes to a serious equity crisis and poverty. What is hopeful is that we can actually help stop the environmental crises, reduce poverty and other inequities, and give more opportunities to all people in our community simply by building and using robust public transportation systems. I grew up in San Francisco using public transit as a young person, which gave me a lot of independence. But I later moved to rural California and there were no transit options there. My high school was about 15-minute drive away. And it was the school bus. Without a car, there really wasn't a way to participate in after-school activities or summer job. Later, as I became a student at UC Davis, access to safe biking, affordable busing, and trains let me get around town and into Sacramento and the Bay Area. I didn't own a car for years in college, but I didn't need one to get to classes, work, and activities on and off campus. That helped save a lot of money, and UC Davis inspired me to become an environmental activist. Many families cannot afford a car today, and the lack of public transportation is the #1 barrier to education and a better job. I like to give a little history about transit inequity in this country because understanding how we got to where we are now gives us information on how to change and not make mistakes of the past. Next slide. In the 1940s and 50s, the United States was a world leader in public transportation. Next slide. After World War II, a number of industries ganged together against the majority will of the people and systematically destroyed most of our public transportation systems. Next slide. The electric trolleys that were really popular and provided a clean, quiet way to get to work were scrapped. Next slide. The highway lobbyists steamrolled the voices of the people, and the public realized that building so many new freeways evicted people from their homes, sliced apart communities, and resulted in abandonment and decay in city after city. Next slide. Communities fought to stop the outrageous highway developments. The highway gang was so powerful, they controlled the government spending on transit. Next slide. And the Federal Highway Act of 1956 authorized 51,000 miles of interstate highways spanning the nation. We taxpayers covered 90% of the cost, and our gas taxes increased for the Highway Trust Fund. Next slide. Opportunities were destroyed as highways were built literally through the bedrooms of Black and brown communities. Next slide. Families that could afford to buy a car had access to better jobs, medical care, getting to the voting booth, and being involved in their political process. People stuck on the wrong side of the highways without a car away from the job centers, faced poverty. This is going on still today. Black and brown civil rights activists worked for over 100 years to fight for equality in riding the buses and trains. And in one decade, racism and classism was systematized as public transit systems were destroyed, contributing to the crisis of opportunity access today. Next slide. Companies spend billions of dollars on slick, strategic ads, tricking people into believing that cars make us sexy, rugged, powerful, and rich. 70 years of strategic marketing convinced us that cars made us free and American. But in reality, investing in building robust public transportation gives more freedom and more opportunities to more people in our communities. Imagine you've just graduated from college, you have no money, a lot of student debt, and you start looking for work. You find a great job about 30 minutes away, but you can't afford a car to get there. So you have to take a lower paying job in your neighborhood that barely pays the bills. If you live in a community like Berkeley or Seattle or Portland, where you can get to work easily by a bus or train or trolley or a bike, you can take a better paying job and not have to spend $14,000 a year it takes to buy a car and keep a car running. You can then save money, which gives you choices. Maybe you want to save money and buy a house instead of a car, and use a car sharing service like Zipcar when you need one. That's the awareness that we are working to bring to the community here. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists, for introducing yourselves to our audience today. I am getting very excited for the conversation amongst all of you and all of the things that we are going to learn from each of your unique expertise and specializations in the environmental field. Our first question, and before I delve into our questions, just to again, just a friendly reminder for each of us to remember our translators and interpreters and to speak slow and steady for those who need the service to translate or who are on the receiving end of those services. And for anybody else who might be using closed caption services to please dictate as much as possible. Our first question is, how have environmental injustices affected you and the community you serve? And how do you see your work helping achieve healthy communities? I believe that this is going to be just an unmute and share your expertise. So go ahead to anyone who already has an answer teed up.
I could answer that first. Hey, everyone. This is really exciting. There's like so many intersections that I would love to talk to all of you about. But yeah, I think the neighborhood that I live in is a really great example of environmental racism. And specifically, I think just the concentration of brown poor folks is not like a coincidence. And so the consequences of redlining and racist covenants has really kind of intensified segregation in LA. And then during the industrial period of LA, all those jobs, all that pollution was concentrated in the East and Southeast region, which surrounds Boyle Heights and East LA. And so just the amount of pollution that we're surrounded by. And then I really appreciate Lonnie's presentation of the freeways, because our neighborhood has 5 freeways that run through our neighborhood. And so the amount of pollution that these freeways cause and the amount of health issues that we experience here are dramatic. And so for us, it was really important to really think about how we can access land and control land, because that was one of the main reasons we had no way of accessing or controlling what was put into our neighborhoods. And so for us, a community land trust was just an addition to all the activism and environmental justice that's happening here. We really were thinking about how do we thrive in our neighborhood? And for us, it's controlling land, and it's having access to land, and it's stewarding land. And so for us, community land trust isn't just for housing, but it's also around creating green space. It's about healing land. It's about having a new relationship to land. And so for us, it was really important to have a community land trust in the neighborhood. On top of all the other things that are happening to stop the 710 freeway from expanding, from closing down factories or repairing the pollution left by factories. We really just needed this other tool and this other mechanism for us to thrive in this neighborhood. And so for us, it's not only having our community land trust, but making sure that there's more community land trust in LA County. And so we've been supporting and working with other neighborhoods to make sure that they have a community land trust in their neighborhood as well. So that's my piece, but thanks y'all.
Any other panelists have responses to that question?
I have a prepared response. I'm happy to go ahead with it. And if we could queue up the next slide after the one that we just left off with, that would be great. I had so much information, I didn't want to leave it to extemporaneous speech today. So can we get that next slide queued up? Wonderful, perfect. Thank you so much. Environmental injustice really impacts our entire community by trying to rob us of truth. Environmental injustice. Organizations like ours are constantly having to do the work of educating against greenwashing, sly marketing, and misinformation. Wealthy special interests pour millions of dollars into tricking voters to elect their representatives for government positions when they can push highway widening and defund public transportation. Next slide, please. Electric trains and trolleys using steel tracks are the cleanest, most energy efficient form of transportation ever invented. And while the rest of the advanced world is building more robust public rail and bus transit systems, next slide, please. The public transit systems in the United States have fallen far behind the rest of the advanced world. And with that, we have become one of the top polluters. Even e-cars, next slide, please, come with a toxic environmental impact as chemicals from billions of tires cause serious health issues. Manufacturing automobiles, which have a short lifespan, means mining and depleting our natural resources, whereas trains and trolleys last decades longer. Toxic tire and brake dust from automobiles enter our air, water, and soils and cause serious long-term health issues. Next slide, please. A number of health issues have skyrocketed starting in the 1940s and 50s with increased tires and plastics, including autism, Alzheimer's, cancers, hormone dysfunction, gut disorders, asthma, and more. Next slide, please. Typically, the poorest neighborhoods feel the worst impact of big highways, busy roads, and poor public transit services. But there is great news. Next slide, please. Our organization has joined a large and growing national coalition of equity, environmental, and labor organizations serving to bring awareness and action, shifting from our national transit equity crisis towards making public transportation and safe streets for biking and walking a priority. It is essential that members of underrepresented communities have a place at the table of all government agencies that make decisions regarding transit. and our efforts are to bring awareness and bring people together for these important events. Thank you.
Thank you, Lonnie. We have a couple of more set questions, and then I know that we will go into audience Q&A. For those of you who maybe don't have your chat up, we have slido.com codes available for you to submit questions to our panel, but we will get going on our second question, which is, what are some of the biggest challenges that come up in your work, and what best case scenario solutions do you envision for solving them? And Roberto and Lonnie just spoke, so I invite Kiki or Irene to speak first.
I'm happy to dive into that question, especially because I think Lonnie set it up very well when she talked about the role that companies can have in trying to sway voters, sway people towards, misleading them about climate issues. So I would say one of the biggest challenges that we face, especially in my work on buildings, I presented a bit on that, but another like a flip side of that work. So the buildings is, we are interacting in our buildings every day, but there's a lot about the energy system that is sort of behind the scenes that you don't typically think about going about your day. So for me, and a big challenge that I have experienced in this work is the role that some of these big gas companies, gas utilities that serve only gas, can play in trying to dampen our efforts to equitably transition communities and people and households to clean electric appliances as we need to do to achieve our climate goals. We have seen them come out with reports that are really misleading about the costs of transitioning to electrification. We see these big corporations come out with trying to sell these fantasy solutions that are super expensive, that will continue to pollute communities with all of because they want to use these drop-in fuels that they are call renewable natural gas, or renewable fuels that they want to drop into the pipes that currently serve gas to customers. But essentially, at the end of the day, those fuels, no matter where they're sourced, you're still burning them in communities, and you're still releasing carbon dioxide and other pollutants. And the companies like to mislead people about that. So that's, I think, a persistent challenge that we see. But a solution to that is, honestly, events like this and other efforts to really engage communities and educate on climate issues in a culturally sensitive way, and try to connect these issues to people's everyday lives so they can start to understand how energy, how transportation issues, how food issues are affecting them in ways that they might not have the privilege to think about in their daily lives. And it might take different forums like this to bring about awareness of these issues.
I feel so grateful to be on a panel with such amazing minds. I'll jump in and share a little bit about the first question about the environmental disparities or injustices that are situated in the work that I'm in. So here in Watsonville, we're known as the salad bowl of America. Our strawberries go all over the world, yet our family members and young people here can't afford to purchase some of the organic produce that's grown here. So when I think about what are some of the biggest challenges, it's really a disparity of wealth and lack of access to land in a way that allows for deep, meaningful connection to the land. Most of the land that's here is dedicated to conventionally grown agriculture that's operated in a very extractive way in a way that's demeaning and violent to the people who work the land and have historically worked the land, including Japanese, Filipino, and more commonly now Mexican indigenous people who are living in substandard conditions and treated inhumanely. So a lot of the young people that we serve at Food What, that's their family members. That's what they grew up with, seeing and even experiencing themselves firsthand. So I think what we're trying to do is create a space that's completely different, a new paradigm. And our theory of change is rooted really in the practice of what could it look like to engage with one another on land, growing food, eating food, cooking food in a way that values the whole self, the whole picture, and really honors young people at whatever stage they're at in their journey, and honors their wholeness, and really creates a lot of space for compassion and healing. And that has to include the land, and it has to acknowledge that we live within such violent paradigms that sees land as pure resource to be extracted, and humans to be pure resource or labor to be extracted. So at Food What, we really try to engage the young people on our crew by paying them a fair livable wage, by honoring their wellness and mental health, especially. I think because we work with young people, a huge issue right now is mental health, and not enough resources for mental health support, and also just the economic barriers that can allow someone to access those resources. I'll also say that one of the hugest barriers that I feel like is really creating a challenge for so many of our intersecting fields of work is a culture, a government that values war and weapons and wants to put more money and resources into that, as opposed to education, food access. We have, one of the most abundant, wealthiest countries, yet people go hungry here every day. So I think we really have to do more work to shift the culture of violence and obsession with war and weapons to move towards life-affirming values. Thank you.
Yeah, can I share now? Or? Yeah.
Certainly, yes.
Oh yeah. Yeah, I think one of the things that we struggle with is this, like having community be a prime decision maker and agent in terms of how we shape our communities. And a great example is what the MTA or the transit agency did to this neighborhood in terms of forcing a community into having a rail and using the rail as a form of displacing people, people who are transit oriented, people who depend on transit, were forced to have a train go into their neighborhood while they're bus reliant, like dependent, and that the bus lines actually take them to the destinations that they need to go to work. And for us, like that was a big issue for us. And knowing that transit could be good for communities, but at the same time, if we're not careful, it's used as a mechanism to displace people in a gentrifying area like LA. And so for us, it's been like a 15-year fight here in this neighborhood to ensure that all the land that was taken by the MTA to build the rail is then turned into a community benefit. But not only do we want community benefits, but we also want to be able to control the land. We want to be able to control the resources that are brought. Because if we get affordable housing, for how long do we get affordable housing? Do we get it for 30 years? Do we get it for 15 years? And how do we make sure it's perpetual? How do we make sure that community residents have a say in terms of how we even build affordable housing in our neighborhoods, specifically for land that's owned by a public agency like the MTA? And so for us, that's been a huge issue. And for agencies and for departments in the county and in the city to understand that people should have control over the land, that people should have control over their housing, that people should be able to determine that a vacant lot shouldn't be turned into luxury housing, but it should potentially be turned into a community garden where they can have access to fresh food. And so for us, it's a really strong sometimes line that we have to create and really understand how our public officials and our agencies are approaching things, and to make sure that folks who live in the neighborhood are really kind of like have agency around decision making, instead of having things imposed onto the neighborhood that are perpetuating displacement and gentrification in the neighborhood. So it's complex. It's complex.
Lonnie, do you have a response you'd like to throw into number 2?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I won't stick to the thing that I wrote. I just want to reiterate what Kiki said earlier, and that is marketing is so powerful, and the wealthiest of investors have a lot of power to control the narrative that people are hearing. I give a simple example that corporations pour tons of money into commercials that show happy children drinking sugary sodas and eating sugary treats on TV, but they don't show the rotten teeth and the obesity and the health issues that come from those foods. By the same token, with the transportation industry, automobile commercials show handsome, rugged men driving powerful cars with beautiful women by their sides, hair whipping in the wind over rocky terrain. And these commercials make us feel a certain way. And unfortunately, we often vote based on our feelings as opposed to really thinking about how these decisions and it's really difficult. And I'd say another thing that I want to talk about is greenwashing, because greenwashing is used so prevalently in so many ways now. And we're facing kind of something similar but different to what Roberto's experiencing here in this town, where we have this Measure D. We've been working hard to bring public rail transportation that it can intersect with our buses. And, you know, some of the wealthiest land developers and investors in the county are running this slick greenwashed misinformation campaign that is basically promising a trail when we're already building a trail in our community. And that would forever wipe out our opportunity to have public rail transportation. Investors, the other thing I was going to say is investors spend a lot of money to lobby their representatives into government positions. And of course, those government positions, if you don't sit in these meetings, you don't realize how much is actually going on under the covers. Well, most people are so busy with work and school and life and jobs, and corporations keep people too busy working more than 40 hours a week, and that keeps people away from being able to participate in meetings. A lot of these meetings are held during the daytime, during work and school hours. And I think that's where the part of the answer is, working with organizations that can help inform us as to what's going on in these meetings, so that we can have empowerment to make informed decisions. And that's what our work is about, is helping to bring awareness so people can make informed decisions.
Wow, very robust questions and answers to these questions. I know that we have a third one where we kind of delve a little bit into some of the personal aspects of ourselves beyond wearing just our hats. And so with this, if you could kind of keep it short so we can continue to have about 10 minutes for audience Q&A, that would be helpful to keep us on time. The third question here is, when was the moment you realized your identity or self-expression mattered in your work? This can go for your race or ethnicity, your gender, etc. And I invite anyone to tee up.
Well, I'll just jump in. I thought this was an interesting question because I keep so busy that, you know, growing up, I didn't really think about my gender or ethnicity as the leading thing for me. What mattered to me was my family, my friends, learning, getting a great education, having really great relationships, and really striving to get involved in activities. And I was involved in a lot, from agriculture to music to theater, athletics, and all sorts of things. Even though when I was in school, people called me wetback because Buddha and all sorts of things, they would say, you know, go back to your own country. And I'm like, well, I'm indigenous Polynesian. I'm not Mexican, but, you know, obviously this person is, to me, was ignorant. But what I did to get through those types of things was find alliances with good friends and with similar values, and focused on educating myself and staying involved in a lot of activities. I didn't let the noise of mean people stop me from my personal goals. And as a parent, I spent a lot of energy volunteering for my son's theater group. And as I said earlier, I was a mountain biking coach. I think that a lot of our young people today don't have family support and come from families of trauma. There's a lot of cyclical generational trauma in our country and in our world. So it's really important to seek out mentors, and help each other through these challenges. It's easy to get taken off track and get involved in drugs or sex to meet our needs emotionally. And so I just urge everybody to be a mentor and to be mentored. And young people, look for young people who are struggling and say, hey, you are a great potential. You are an important part of our community. How can we get you together with someone who can mentor you in a way that's going to make a difference? Because all of us are a part of a village, and we all have to help each other to rise up to meet these incredible crises that we're facing today. Oh, I just want to say John Lewis. So here's my little thing. Don't try to be a hero. Get involved with local political process. Take scary steps to be a leader. And I love John Lewis's quote, make good trouble.
Yeah, I feel like I've had a lot of moments, but I'll share some of my most recent ones. During the pandemic, I've had the privilege to co-found two organizations. Both of them are what we call BIPOC led, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and they're intentionally BIPOC led. In this process of forming them, I think it was just really as important for this collective of people who were forming these organizations to realize how much we have to offer, how much skill set we have, how much experience we have, and how important it is for us to be resonating with the folks that we work with, because they're the ones that lead this work. And I'm really grateful for a lot of white folks, but at the same time, like I learned that I thrive more in BIPOC-led organizations. And I've seen other people thrive more in BIPOC-led organizations. And so for me, it's essential to be part of BIPOC-led movement and work with allies and have roles for allies. And so for me, it's made a huge difference in the self-esteem of the movement that I'm a part of. And a little bit of like what Lonnie was sharing is, and at the same time, like I've also learned as a man of color that I need to lean into healing. I need to lean into accountability. I need to lean into communities that actually practice it, so that it's not an isolating thing, because it's scary. Because yeah, like I think BIPOC folks have a lot of trauma. the world has a lot of trauma. And sometimes we're expected to be these like model minorities, even among like brown and black folks, you know? And so we need spaces that we can lean onto harm, we can lean into healing, we can lean into these things, so that we don't end up leaving like more hurt than when we started. So for me, I think those are kind of my reflections around identity.
Can go next. Yeah, this question was it took me kind of in a deep place, because our identity, of course, colors everything that I do, because it's the way that it's the context in which I perceive the world. It has to do with race, it has to do with class, education, and all those things. So, you know, as somebody who has Mexican indigenous roots, also Irish roots, I have a college education. I can navigate systems of white supremacy well, right? Like I can navigate systems well. It does offer me a privilege that isn't afforded to a lot of the young people I work with, some of my colleagues. So that is something that I have to hold with a lot of accountability and consciousness, because it does inform the way that I move through the world. And it's hard for me to think of an exact moment. But I think like whiteness has its way of rearing its ugly head, and even BIPOC folks, or the ways that we've been socialized to exist in a world that is the dominant culture of white supremacy. I think another part of my identity that's really important is someone socialized as a woman, struggling with a lot of like, you know, gender performance of like, oh, who can be, you know, I'm out here being a farmer, I'm a painter, I'm like digging things, I'm using my body in ways that I don't feel is always, you know, allowed for women to show up. So yeah, and also as a person who is reconnecting with my indigenous roots, I feel like there's a moment where I was thinking, I think this was during the pandemic, I was connecting with my abuelita who was born in Oaxaca, but because of the process of assimilation and moving to the United States, of being, you know, through the really violence of becoming a US citizen and forgetting one's roots, she was, didn't grow up to appreciate her roots, her indigenous roots. So the way that I had to start asking about it was through the food or through the herbs. And that was something that we do with the young people at Food What too. We have a workshop on food as medicine and traditional remedios, like asking our family members, what are things that we have heard our family members or relatives using, you know, for a cold or for a stomach ache, and why are those, why is that knowledge, that traditional knowledge, not accessible to us? Because that's ancestral technology, and why don't we have easy access to that? So there was a part, there are moments for me where I was like, I have this rich knowledge within my bloodline, within my like DNA memory, and also with my relatives that I can tap into for resilience, for courage to move through this world. Because I think we often forget, we talk about like, oh, these are end days, apocalypse days, but indigenous communities everywhere have been enduring apocalyptic times, right? Since Europeans landed, really. And I think that it's important to encourage one another, encourage ourselves, encourage young people to tap into that traditional knowledge that we do have, that we have access to, and that can give us great power and great strength, even if they're not recognized by dominant culture. Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll try to be brief with my, just really quickly. I think that at least in some of the spaces that I operate in, some of these like big environmental organizations, even though like the environmental movement is really rooted and has been like, you know, like pushed forward by Black and Indigenous and Brown folks, I think growing up, I viewed environmentalism as like a very white space, and honestly, like a lot of organizations still are very white spaces. And I've noticed this in the, you know, my identity being, you know, an important voice to have heard in the work that I do with buildings, especially because home, like our buildings, you know, and also even the technologies that we use in our buildings, homes are such like a personal space, and there's so much of our culture is tied to our homes. For example, as I'm, you know, pushing for these solutions to decarbonize our buildings, one of them involves, you know, switching off of gas stoves. And when you know, I think about like my mom and my abuela and them using the comal, like I can't even imagine them using their comal on an electric cooktop. But, you know, so sort of approaching with this like cultural understanding, and obviously, you know, we need many voices in the space representing all kinds of different cultures, not just like my Mexican heritage, but you know, just it helps me, it reminds me, you know, anytime that I spend time with my family in our like home, how like the importance of crafting, you know, policies that will get us to our decarbonization goals, because that's obviously imperative, you know, to tackle climate change, but also doing that in a culturally competent way, and like making sure that we're doing our best to preserve like the beautiful cultural diversity that takes place in our homes.
Thank you all so much. I know that as each of you were talking and laying out your responses to these really big questions, a lot of our audience members were resonating with some of the things that you said. And I'm so sorry to cut our conversation off, but in the interests of protecting, you know, our fellow speakers later for our agenda and our event today, we do have our audience members Q&A. I believe that the Slido and the Climate of Hope code is still available for you to submit audience questions for our panelists today. And while we are not able to touch on some of the questions that you have submitted, hopefully we will be able to work with the panelists to answer some of your questions. And with that, I thank you, each of you, for bringing your knowledge, your intersectional identities, the many reminders of, you know, working on behalf of community members, and bringing your whole full selves to not just myself as your moderator and to everybody else participating in the event, but to our abundance of audience members who are tuned in today. Thank you so much, everyone.